The early days, oh, a better nation, fair and free, Scotland.
Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast episode number 167. In just a few minutes we'll get to the main interview of the show. However, before that, I'd like to share some information with you. I've just realised I grew up in a place called As Far Away As Possible. What the hell am I talking about? Have a listen to this.
Waiting to talk to us on 606. Christopher Sutton is here. Well, he's not. He's in Glasgow, as far away from me as possible.
So there's a perfect example of the London-centric view of the world that the BBC has been broadcasting all these years. Just in the interest of clarity, I'd like to say that actually, even if she was only referring to other BBC studios when she said as far away as possible, BBC do have studios in Kirkwall and Lerwick, so Glasgow doesn't count as far away as possible in terms of BBC studios. The furthest city away from London is actually Dunedin in New Zealand, so that's as far away as possible on the planet. Just in case the BBC might have missed this, people actually have been to the moon. So, as far away as possible seems a rather strange phrase to use when you're talking about London and Glasgow. Anyway, on to the show. This week I spoke with Dr. Craig Dalzell, who's the Head of Policy and Research for the Common Weal. We talked about two things, principally. The recent GERS report, how seriously it should be taken, what it shows and what it doesn't show. Then we got on to the new paper that the Common Weal are putting out on what currency should be used in an independent Scotland. There's a lot of information in there, but it's not as heavy as it might sound. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Hi Craig, how's it going?
Hello, I'm good. Yourself?
Yeah, it's good to be back. It's a long time since I've done an interview. Having the Wayne's not given me much free time. He's still pretty small, so that's taking up a lot of time.
Well, we've all been missing you.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, what we're on about today is two things. But first, I suppose, it's the usual GERS clusterfuck. Yeah, straight back in where it counts. Okay, so what I'd like to ask you is it worth the paper it's printed on, or is it... let me rephrase that. Because some people on one side say that the whole GERS thing has no value whatsoever, it's simply an exercise in making Scotland look bad, and on the other side what we're hearing is it's always a total disaster for Scotland, and Scotland is uniquely disastrous when it comes to financial affairs. Are you somewhere in the middle of that, or do you think one side is more correct than the other?
Right, well, as with almost everything on the internet, it's very easy to fall into an extreme position on this. To give a very, very brief history of GERS, it was created in the early 90s by the Conservatives explicitly to try and undermine the devolution movement. It has been improved since. When devolution did come along, especially after the SNP government took control, there was a lot of effort done to tighten up the methodology involved and turn it into a useful measure of national accounts. But some people still look at the areas where it's weak and kind of attack it there. That's fine. All statistical things have their weaknesses and have their improvements that can be made. What you cannot do with GERS is take it as it is and say this is what an independent Scotland would look like, because independence changes things. One example being a lot of the reserved civil servants working in Whitehall doing stuff for Scotland. Well, the economic activity that employment generates is benefiting England. Scotland becomes independent, those jobs come to Scotland, and we get a boost to our economy from that. A whole bunch of other changes on top of that. And additionally, if you're becoming independent, you're doing something different with your economy. Otherwise, what's the point? So, as a measure of Scotland, the region within the UK, I'll take GERS as it is, and we can focus on the bits that maybe can be tightened up. But let's just, take it and see what it tells us about now. But we can't then sort of use it to project forward too much with a lot of caveats involved.
And just to stay on that idea of things would be different in an independent Scotland for a second, wouldn't there be lots, you mentioned the civil service as one idea, but wouldn't there be lots of other things that are currently factored into the UK-wide accounts that would go straight into Scotland accounts and deal with a lot of the, in inverted commas, problems that we see in the GERS account?
Probably, and there's probably going to be some stuff that moves to the remaining UK as well. It's a very complex issue, and exactly what happens also depends on, the eventual withdrawal agreement between Scotland and England and how much sharing between departments happens, or do we set up two, if there's maybe cooperative agreement, do we do that instead of one department sitting in one country but sharing administration, or do we do it on the principle of two departments cooperating? It's such a complex issue. It's very difficult to get it across, and certainly difficult to get it across in something as short as Twitter, which is where people do sort of sometimes run away with extreme positions one way or the other.
One of the things that seems strange in this particular version of GERS is the fact that Scotland, with a very small percentage of the population of the United Kingdom, suddenly seems to be responsible for a very large percentage of the national debt. Can that be justified, or is there some sort of sleight of hand going on there?
Now this is really where GERS becomes quite interesting, and it really shows you the problems of the UK as a country. Yeah, I think I was one of the first commentators to start talking about this, and others have picked it up and have delved into it a bit more. When you do the same sort of methodology for GERS to the other nations of the UK, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, you do find that suddenly a lot of the UK's deficit seems to be coming from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. You delve into it further, you split England up into regions, and it turns out that the only real surplus regions of the UK are London and the South East. So what we're seeing is an economic model where London gets all of the economy and everything else getting handouts. And worse than that, we are then told that we should like it.
Didn't we know that already?
Well, we kind of did, but it's very interesting when you see it in numbers.
Yeah.
And worse than that, this gap seems to be growing. In the last few years, especially since the 2008 financial crash, all of the growth in the UK seems to be concentrated in London and the South East. Everywhere else is improving slightly, but nowhere near the gap between, basically London and everywhere else is growing. There's a lot of tension developing in the UK because of this. It's not just a problem that's unique to Scotland.
And isn't that intensified by the fact that, the major capital spending projects also tend to benefit London and the South East? The high-speed rail and stuff, which is classified as a national project, so even more money gets spent on their infrastructure, which will accelerate the problem that you're describing.
Yeah, well, HS2 is a great example of that. HS2 is not designed to bring jobs from London up to Manchester. It's designed to bring Manchester into the London commuter belt. We've heard that phrase before, pooling and sharing. And this is really what it looks like in the UK. All of the economic activity, all of the investment is pooled into London, and maybe everywhere else gets a little bit in return. It's like trickle-down economics on a national scale.
Get to the back of the bus on a national scale.
Exactly.
So, if you look at the latest GERS figures then, what's Scotland doing well? What could be improved?
Well, in this regard, GERS isn't really telling us much more than we've really learned in the last few years. We're one of the more prosperous regions of the UK, but we're just kind of getting held back by the lack of investment. Devolution helps to a degree, but the Scottish Government just doesn't have the major powers over things like corporation tax and the wealth taxes that it really needs to jumpstart that kind of investment. We are seeing some improvements with things like the National Investment Bank that will be coming online in a few years, but that's for the future. That's not online yet. And
what about the idea that the current GERS figures is not factoring in Brexit?
Well, GERS isn't a predictive document. It only tells you what has happened in the past year, so it can't tell us what's going to happen in the run-up to Brexit. We're going to have to wait for a couple more years to see the impact of that filtering into GERS.
Although the government are going to release some of the impact documents, they said.
Well, the UK government has started today releasing some of its technical notices of its planning for a no-deal Brexit. I haven't had a chance to read very many of them yet, but what I have read is not painting a rosy picture.
What do you think about the way the media reacts to GERS? Because, you said Twitter before and people taking extreme positions, but every single time the GERS figures come out, all we hear is disaster for Scotland, disaster for Scotland, disaster for Scotland. Are you strongly convinced that that's an ideological way of looking at it rather than a factual way of looking at it?
I think maybe ideological is a bit strong. I mean, it is the country's national accounts, so you would expect a little bit of attention placed on it. But I have noticed that some of the reporting, at least, almost doesn't seem to understand even some of the basic principles of devolution. I saw one report on the BBC, which has now been officially retracted and apologised for, that stated that the figures in GERS were a result of the Scottish Government running up a deficit, when in fact that GERS covers not just the devolved spending but also the reserved spending by Westminster. And in fact, the Scottish Government runs a balanced budget within its remit, if not a small surplus. You get it's actually quite funny. A few months ago, we had the report of the Scottish Government underspend, which, if it happened at a UK level, they would call a budget surplus. Yeah. So it's almost like some sections of the media, probably more driven by opposition political parties, I should say, are just looking for bad news and trying to create it when they can find it.
So can we just explore for a moment then a bit more what the national accounts would look like if Scotland were an independent country, and how that would be different from GERS?
As I say, it is very difficult to say from the outset because it depends on so many factors that are unknown at the moment. It depends on the depth of and the detail of the withdrawal agreement. But you would hope that using the increased powers of independence, the Scottish Government could cancel austerity, which has been a real drag on the UK economy. It could start investing, and over time it could reduce inequality within the UK and grow the economy somewhat, and grow the feeling of well-being in the economy, which is probably more important than the sheer size of it.
And one last thing on GERS, and then we'll move on to the new policy paper that's coming out. There's another idea that goes around more on the independence side, that GERS itself is a very bad advert for the Union. These figures themselves say that if you're saying that Scotland's economy is a dog's dinner, then that's within the Union, and therefore the fault lies there. Do you find that kind of convincing argument, or are there also problems with that?
No, that's probably a fair statement, and especially again what we've seen in GERS in the last couple of years is just how it shows how unequal the UK is as a country. Examples of that within the GERS you can see in the relatively low rates of return on things like income tax, on corporation tax, on inheritance tax are relatively low in Scotland compared to our population within the UK. Interestingly, while income tax is lower as a proportion of the UK, our VAT returns are roughly the same, which basically says to me that extremely rich people might have more money, but they're not buying that much more stuff than most of us. If you've got 15 times the income than I do, that's fair enough, but you don't need 15 times as much clothes. You don't need 15 fridges. You don't need 15 times as much stuff.
This is true.
So if you really want to stimulate the economy, you don't look at the rich, you look at ordinary folk. And there's too many folk in the country today who basically, all of their money goes on their rent, their gas bill and their commute, and they don't have any money left for anything else. It's no wonder we saw Poundland, was it Pound World, go into administration lately. If people can't afford to shop in pound shops, what's going on?
All right, so let's move on then. The last couple of times we talked about currency on this podcast, we actually talked about cryptocurrencies, which
yes,
people find massively confusing. And let's just say, from a purely practical point of view, I don't think it's going to be a massive winner with the over 70s that we have to convince for Scottish independence. Vote for Scottish independence. You can all start using cryptocurrencies, and you get Bitcoin by a guy mining on a computer, and there's people, and that's not going to cut much ice. So cryptocurrencies will leave to one side for the moment.
Yes. Although it is quite interesting that Venezuela, which is in the throes of hyperinflation at the moment, has recently revalued its currency. It's launched a new currency that is traded with the old currency at 100,000 to 1, so they basically knocked 5 zeros off of their banknotes, but they've also pegged it to a nationally owned cryptocurrency that's tied to the value of their oil. I'll be very interested to see how this works